Folks, just a quick note that this episode marks the end of Season 1 of Antarctic Stories. We'll return with Season 2 beginning in January 2020 with a whole host of new, fascinating polar people and their stories. Please click subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so that you'll be notified when Season 2 drops. And of course, if you have any suggestions of people you'd love to hear on the program, please send us a message through our Facebook page or email us at contact@twintracksexpeditions.com. Thank you so much for listening. Welcome to Antarctic Stories, a podcast that takes you behind the scenes into the rich world of people who live, work, and undertake daring expeditions in the polar regions. My name is Heather Thorkelson, and I'll be your host today. Today on Antarctic Stories, we have a different kind of guest. In fact, there are two, Dave Weisman and Tami Harris. After many requests to feature tourists who have been to the polar regions, we've invited these intrepid globetrotters on the show to share their polar experiences. Tami's work background is in international not-for-profits and education, while Dave was a finance professional in institutional sales. But then, Dave retired in 2012, and Tami followed shortly, retiring in 2013. Originally from Chicago, they moved to Springfield, Illinois to help with family, and now spend 75% of their time traveling, mostly internationally. Tami and Dave have been traveling regularly since January 7th, 2013. They have since visited all 7 continents and 82 separate countries, some multiple times. Tami herself has been to 94 countries, and Dave has been to 90. They are still enjoying their travels and have no plans to stop. Dave and Tami, welcome to Antarctic Stories.
Thank you. We're happy to be here with you today.
Looking forward to talking about our adventures and our time, and I hope it's of help to some other people.
100%. I mean, as we spoke in the sort of pre-recording session, we've gotten quite a number of requests to hear more from the average traveler that goes to the polar region. So I immediately thought of you folks because I've traveled with you both in the Antarctic and the Arctic. And I think because you're so well traveled, you're sort of an ideal couple to come in and share your experiences. Now, normally when people go to book a trip to Antarctica in particular, it's become sort of a hot spot. It's the 7th continent. Everyone gets very excited about going there. But there are a lot of different options. There are different sizes of ships, different styles of company. So you being very well-traveled people, once you decided that you wanted to book a trip to Antarctica, how did you decide which was the right trip for you?
Well, I would start by saying that we actually booked or thought we were going to book the wrong trip for us. We didn't know it was the wrong trip for us until we'd had a chance to spend more time talking to consultants and people who knew more about ships and voyages. And then we changed, but we actually thought we wanted to book what would have been the wrong trip for us.
We thought we wanted to cross the circle, that was going to be our prime reason for doing this trip. And we talked to a gentleman about the different options. And he asked us a lot of really good questions. What do you want to get out of it? Why do you want to do this? How long do you want to go? What type of ship? And he talked about all the options. You can go on a really fancy ship where there's a hairdresser and you dress up for dinner and there's maybe 500 people. Or you could go on a very tiny ship that maybe is a sailboat and you're going to be knocked around the Drake Passage and your experience might be a little rocky. And we decided to go with a ship that was 100 people because we understood that everybody could do landings at basically the same time and not run the risk of one group of 100 people doing a landing in the morning and then by the afternoon or the time it's time for the second group, then the clouds have moved in or the winds have come down and the other group didn't have that opportunity. So we wanted to maximize our chances of seeing the wildlife and seeing the beautiful landscape. And so we decided to go with a 100 passenger ship.
We also made a decision and a choice based on our interest in seeing wildlife, that crossing the circle and going down the peninsula was not nearly as important to us as getting to the Falklands and South Georgia. So it completely changed our perspective as to what a trip to Antarctica would mean and what ship we should choose and how we should choose it. And so that for us was answering all these questions and narrowing down the scope so that we really only had a choice of maybe 2 or 3 or 4 ships that met those objectives. And then this one was available, and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bring up so many good points, and especially about the Falklands and South Georgia, because that's something that a lot of people aren't even aware of as an option. They think of Antarctica, they think of the Antarctic Peninsula, but as you mentioned, you were really keen to see wildlife. And so the advisor you were speaking with obviously understood very clearly that you probably should be made aware of the advantages of adding in South Georgia to your trip, because that is an absolute wildlife mecca. And even more so than in Antarctica, there are landing restrictions in South Georgia that require even smaller numbers, 50 passengers at a time. So ship size definitely matters. That's really great that you were able to go from one would have been the wrong trip potentially to booking eventually on the right trip. Now that was back in February 2016, correct?
That's right.
Right. So that is when I met you actually the first time, because I was working on the same ship that you were traveling on. Now, this may actually, my question is specifically around Antarctica, but South Georgia, the Falklands might come into play here. What did you find the most unexpected about your trip, about Antarctica?
Well, a lot. But for me, one of the most unexpected things I found was the weather. I was expecting it to be minus 20 degrees with horrible winds, and I was going to have to bundle up every day and get cold while we were out on our expeditions. But I found that a lot of times I was taking my coat off, I was down to my shirt sleeves, and the weather was just very comfortable and the temperature was great. And you got so enthralled in seeing the wildlife that if it was a little chilly, you didn't even notice it. So that was really unexpected to me.
I would say yes. The weather was obviously could change. It's different for every ship, every day, every passenger. But generally speaking, I think that we were told, and I don't think we believed it. We were told that you could anticipate weather on this voyage not dissimilar from what you might have in a normal winter in Chicago. So it helped us to put it in perspective. It can be really cold. It can be modestly warm.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. And I think people don't realize that when we are there as tourists, it's actually the height of Antarctic summer. And also, when we watch programs on TV about Antarctica, they're usually talking about interior Antarctica, where it's minus 40 or whatever at the South Pole Station. But the peninsula, one of the reasons why it's so magical to visit is because it is one of the warmest parts of Antarctica. I mean, there's things growing there, tiny little plants and stuff. And so that little tidbit will very much help people in their packing for their future voyage. So along those lines, just in terms of your experience of Antarctica, what would you say was your most powerful moment or memory from your trip?
I would say that there were many, and every day was different. Every day was exciting, wildlife and scenery. But I would say in terms of an actual moment or a single memory, it was probably for me waking up the morning that we were passing icebergs that were 10 times the length or 20 times the length of our ship and 3-4 times higher than our ship. And there was 1 to the left and 2 to the right and 4 up ahead. And I think that was the majesty of those icebergs and the otherworldliness of that environment was probably the most striking memory that I have in terms of all of the different things that we saw.
And for me, I would say it was when we saw the sheer number of penguins on land and in the sea. And as far as the eye could see, it was nothing but penguins and penguins. And hearing them chatter and talk and the noises they were making and watching them play and chase their babies around and their babies feeding and playing in the sea, it was just spectacular. I couldn't have imagined there would be that many penguins in one place. I think, at 100,000, a couple of 100,000. And the noise, it was deafening and a little smelly at times too.
Yes, everyone always comments on the smell. So given that you had this really wonderful trip and that you saw what we call kind of the pearls of Antarctica, because you did hit the Falkland Islands, South Georgia, and then the peninsula, what advice would you have for someone like you who's well-traveled, that's thinking of planning a trip to Antarctica?
I would say keep an open mind. You may think you know what you want, but you really may not know what you want. That's what we learned. And talk to a lot of people and do your research, know exactly what type of boat you want, what experience you want, and find somebody really good to help you find that right experience for you. For us, it was really a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and it was so magical because we listened to experts and they helped us really decipher what we wanted to know best. And that would be my strong advice.
I would add only one thing, and Tami mentioned briefly the once-in-a-lifetime perspective. It may or it may not be once in a lifetime for us. And that may be true for others. It may or it may not be once in a lifetime. But one thing that we thought about before we made the decision to go and during the planning process was that we feel like we could always go to Europe, or we could go to South America, or we can go even to Asia once, twice, 3, 4 times. But we decided at the very beginning that we wouldn't shortchange ourselves in terms of the length of time we would spend there, or we spend as much money as we reasonably could because of the perspective that it might be a once-in-a-lifetime situation. And I would say to others, if you gave that consideration, you might decide to spend an extra week. You might decide to spend an extra several $1,000s. You might not want this trip to be the one on which you saved money or time.
I think that's excellent advice. That's really good. And of course, as well, the industry is changing. There's more ships going down now. So on top of there being more options for people, it also means that there's just more traffic around there, right? So taking that into consideration, as you say, assuming that this may be a once in a lifetime trip, really doing your research is a smart move. That's very helpful. So after your Antarctic trip, it wasn't long until you decided to head north and experience the Arctic. And I'm assuming this is because you caught what we call in the industry the polar bug, not uncommon. But given that a lot of people don't know a lot about Arctic tourism, for example, like where can you go in the Arctic? Where can you best see polar bears? And also, like, what's up there? What makes it worth it? What was it that piqued your interest, and how did you start planning your trip to the Arctic?
When we were in Antarctica, as you know, Heather, we were with you and Rickard, your husband, who's also a polar guide, frequently at meals. And we talked a lot with you guys about the Arctic because we really didn't know much about it. And is it more than visiting the North Pole? You know, what can you do in the Arctic? And we also talked to other folks on the ship too, both passengers who we became friends with and other guides who also spent a lot of time in the Arctic in the other season. And we just thought that it would be an amazing experience to be able to do both of the polar regions and to see something different in a kind of similar environment, but very unique and different. And we talked to some of our friends on the ship that we met on the ship from the UK, and we all said, wouldn't it be fun to go to the Arctic together? So, that happened in 16 that we started talking about it, and we kept in touch with these same folks. And over the course of a year, kept talking about it. And so Dave and I said, let's just call Heather and find out what our options may be, because we definitely want to have a small ship experience. And we didn't really know what that meant. Dave and I have been on a lot of very small ship experiences for snorkeling and in the underwater world. So we knew we really liked that environment. So of course we got in contact with you, and you told us about some possible options, but the time frame we wanted to use, most ships were full. You said, however, we're going to start looking for a ship that we can charter, and maybe you'd be interested in that. And we, of course, said, sign us up immediately. We're ready to go. And we talked to our friends, and who also from Antarctica, and all 6 of us said we're in. And we decided at that time, we knew we could trust you guys to put an awesome trip together, and we were not disappointed.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, so that's great. And I think that really speaks to the power of talking to people who do this for a living, right? I mean, I think it's not uncommon for people to go to Antarctica, start talking to the guides, and then they start going, oh, there's this whole other world up in the Arctic that I hadn't even considered before. Maybe we should start thinking about that, right? And it was, as you say, something that connected us, and it was really good timing because we started chartering the small vessels, and away we went. So we're very happy that you decided to travel with us. From a tourist, from a guest perspective, in the Antarctic, you were on a ship with us of around 100 guests, but in the Arctic, you came on a ship with us that was only 12 guests, and that's a dramatic difference. So can you maybe talk a little bit about the difference in those two experiences?
Yes, the ship of 100 guests was intimate in its setting in Antarctica because we needed the size of the ship, we needed the stability of the ship in some of the crossings that we made. But you can't compare that to a ship where 2/3 of the guests can be in the hot tub at one time and wonder where the other 1/3 of the guests are. The intimacy in terms of being able to connect with people, in terms of being able to find out what their stories are, what they took away from a given day that you may not have seen or thought of in the same way, is much different than in a 100-person ship. The ability of the cooks and the captain to make special meals or to go into small coves that other people can't get to on a ship of 12 people is just a materially different situation, a materially different adventure, and it's well worth doing it. But as for me, I wouldn't have wanted to do a 12-passenger ship to Antarctica and South Georgia.
Yeah, understandably. And of course, the thing about 12-passenger vessels in Antarctica is that they largely don't go there, other than, as you said earlier, those little sailboats that go down, and those are kind of full of the most hardcore types. But there's some pretty big sea crossings that need to be done when you're going either across the Drake Passage down to Antarctica, or if you do South Georgia. It's a lot of sea days. And I think the advantage of Svalbard, and one of the reasons why there are more 12-passenger vessels up there, is because there are no official sea days. You leave Longyearbyen and the next day you're doing landings, so it offers us a different option for exploring, which is quite cool. So I suppose, same as my question about the other end of the world, what was the most memorable thing about your trip to the Arctic?
I would say in terms of the single most memorable moment was actually a collection of moments that took maybe half an hour, maybe 45 minutes as our zodiacs, which were probably 30 meters from the shore, went along at a very slow pace with a polar bear walking along the shore, looking at us, just walking and looking and looking. And we thought, he can jump into the water. Our guides assured us, no, our boat is faster than he is. And I actually thought, I'm not so sure that I believe them, because he looked like he could swim really fast. But it was amazing to see that animal that close in that environment, in his environment, or I think it was a he, in the animal's environment, so beautiful and so very close.
Wow.
And I would say I agree with Dave completely about the polar bears. That has to be the most memorable. However, there was a second one, Heather, and it was mostly caused by you.
Me?
And I thought, yes, you. I thought we were jokingly talking about doing the polar plunge, that I agreed to do it with you because I thought we were joking. And then I looked over and thought, oh no, Heather's serious. We're really going to do this. And I thought, well, I've made the commitment to Heather, whether it was a joke or not. So lo and behold, we did the polar plunge. And that first plunge into the water, I should say the only plunge into the water, was breathtaking, literally. It was exciting and it was exhilarating. And what made it the best was that once we were out, we were able to go directly into the sauna and the hot tub and warm up.
Yeah.
But we all did it. You did it, I did it, and Dave did it.
That's true. And I think that was the thing that convinced me as well, because I'd done polar plunges before and I swore I would never again. But having a sauna and a hot tub kind of made me think, it's not going to be that bad. And it'll only be bad for a couple of minutes. Well, I'm really glad that was super memorable for you. It's certainly one of those kind of once in a lifetime things that people tend to do. So if someone was asking you for travel advice, and I have no doubt that they do since you are seasoned travelers, if they were specifically looking for advice to go to the polar regions and whether they were worth it, what would you say?
I would say 100% it's worth it. 200% it's worth it. And we have talked to lots of people. And Dave and I do travel a lot all over the world. And we're often asked, what has been your favorite trip, your most memorable trip? And certainly both of our Arctic and our Antarctic trips have been right up there in the top 3 or 4. They're similar, but they're different. People probably think, as I did, that they would be really very similar experiences, but they weren't. They're very different, and each one is worthy of its own unique trip. And doing both of them and seeing, contrasting and comparing what you're seeing there, and having the small ship experience in the Arctic and the larger ship experience in Antarctica was really unique too, and a good way to get a feel for different ways of traveling and different ways of seeing things. But I would say it's more than just going to the 7th continent. A lot of people do it because of that reason, but you will grow and expand the way you see the world. In fact, everybody needs to go there in our world so they can see what unique atmospheres, animals, landscapes, all this beauty that we have, in fact, in both the Arctic and Antarctica. And maybe we would treat the world a little differently if we could all experience that. And maybe we would make some positive changes in our lives. So yeah, I think it's worth it from a global perspective.
That's absolutely true. It's very difficult even to add anything to that. I would say it's worth it from a global perspective. It's so worth it from a personal perspective. From having seen all of those different things that Tami mentioned and looking at them in the context of other places that you've been. It's just that they are unique enough that you can have been everywhere else but there and have missed a lot more than you've seen.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And as you said, talking about your highlight moment in the Arctic, sailing along close to this big male polar bear, how often do you get the chance to look a creature like that in the eyes in its natural environment? I mean, there's just so few places in the world where you can have such a powerful experience as that. Or as Tami, as you mentioned, with the penguins in the south, being in front of hundreds of thousands of penguins. I mean, it's just, there are so few places in the world where you get to stand there as this tiny little human and think, are you kidding me? Am I in a BBC special? It's wonderful. Thank you for sharing your memories. So do you have any plans in the future to visit somewhere else in our coldest regions, like East Antarctica, Greenland, Northern Canada, Northern Russia, anything like that?
I would say definitely. We would like to explore a lot more in the cold regions. I know we would like to take a trip to Greenland sometime. And we need to learn so much more about what our opportunities are and what might be available for us to do. But, we certainly are ready and willing to take on those cold environments again. We have all the gear now.
Yeah. You can't put that to waste.
For sure. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us your experiences. I know this will really help a lot of listeners who have been thinking about potentially visiting the Arctic or the Antarctic. I know that your insight will definitely be useful to them. And I'm excited to see what the future holds for you, intrepid travelers. I love following along on your social media accounts with such wonderful photos of all these exotic places that you go. So yes, thank you again. And we certainly hope to have you on Antarctic Stories again sometime.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for having us. It was a pleasure.
Thanks again.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Antarctic Stories. If you like the stories we bring to you, please subscribe for future episodes. And if you want to help the podcast, leaving a rating or review greatly assists us in reaching a wider audience. Antarctic Stories is a production of Twin Tracks Expeditions, your experts in small ship expedition cruises to the Arctic and Antarctica. We love sharing our insider knowledge to help you find the perfect ship for your next polar expedition. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, or at twintracksexpeditions.com.